Welcome, everyone. This is Monet, the creator, and I'm so excited to welcome you all to another episode of Navigating the Hidden Curriculum. I created this podcast because becoming a scientist is not necessarily the easiest path. In fact, many people have very nonlinear paths, and because of this, it turns into a bit of a hidden curriculum. The goal of this podcast is to share the scientific journey of others, as I believe this is one of the best ways we can learn what the best path may be for ourselves in the sciences. I am so excited to welcome back to the show Ya'el Courtney, now Dr. Ya'el Courtney. Okay. Ya'el recently earned her PhD in neuroscience from Harvard University, working under Dr. Maria Letnin to explore how the brain develops before we are born. She focused on how exposure to things like medication or recreational drugs during pregnancy may interfere with healthy brain development. Ya'el is passionate about being the head of her own research group one day, where she will study chronic illnesses that happen after viral infection. In fact, she's heading off to Stanford soon to become a postdoc in exactly that topic. Having entered academia from a rather unconventional background, she's also committed to breaking down barriers of all kinds and to help people understand and do science. I already know she has some amazing points to share with us today, so let's get right into it. So, at the time of this recording, it has almost been a month, and you are officially Dr. Ya'el Courtney.
Ooh.
How does it feel to finally be done?
Well, first, I'm happy to be here, and thanks for having me back on the podcast.
Yeah.
The number one word is relief for how it feels to be done. I'm really excited, and it's a goal I've envisioned for a long time, and then kind of naturally in the months leading up to it, it was really stressful.
Yeah.
And I was often juggling a lot of things at once, so the immediate feeling, and when I'm still in the month after, is just being relieved to have accomplished it.
Yeah, I'm sure that feeling is great. Coming from a G3.
The trenches.
Yeah, the trenches, literally, of the PhD. So my next question for this afternoon is, what is an unexpected challenge in preparation for your exam or during your dissertation that you did not expect to run into?
Okay, yeah. So I think it was hard for me even to know what to expect overall in some ways. Mm-hmm. I feel like, we all are here to get a PhD, and we know, you got to publish a paper often, and you need to discover something new. But then when it comes down to, what do you actually have to do at the end to be done?
Yeah.
I feel like that is a mystery in a lot of ways. And our program, and I think very few programs, have, really clear-cut guidance on what you need to do. Mm-hmm. And so one thing I was glad I did that helped me understand part of it was attend other people's PhD defense seminars, because at least then I could get a sense for this, 1 hour public talk that you have to give. How much should it cover? What kind of level of scientific detail are people going into? Mm-hmm. How much data is on the slides? To get a sense for, what's enough? What should my talk be like? If all these people are graduating, what do I need to do? And that's the easier part, because the other part of the PhD kind of final is the written dissertation, which is this, to me, nebulous thing of a couple hundred pages, double-spaced with picky formatting that covers everything you've done. And I was like, oh, well, what does that mean? And that one's so tough because you actually online, you can access other PhDs' dissertations. They're mostly publicly available from different universities. Mm-hmm. And so I would do that, and I'd try to find ones in neuroscience or neurobiology. And even then, some of them are 100 pages, some of them are 300. They had all kinds of different formatting, different kind of forms of language.
Yeah.
And then, at least at Harvard, they don't tell you the requirements for the written dissertation until 6 months before you're required to graduate. And before that, they don't even give them to you. You can't access them publicly until you have something called the quote-unquote packet meeting. And then they give you the packet. And they're like, by the way, here's all the rules, and also finish in 6 months or else. And I was like, oh, my God. And so I guess an unexpected challenge was just not being able to anticipate before that what it was going to be that I had to do. And I'm a person who likes to kind of prepare myself almost years in advance and just know what I should be getting ready for. And it was hard for me to just all of a sudden have my packet meeting, this massive list of here's all the rules and here's what you have to do. Okay, go. So that was tough.
And what was the most enjoyable part about preparing for this exam, or even during the actual exam?
Knowing it was going to be over. No, I'm kidding. Preparing didn't feel that enjoyable. I'm going to be honest. The written dissertation was much less enjoyable, honestly. So in my program, the written dissertation is due 2 weeks before you do your public seminar, which is the 1-hour talk and the slides. That was really, really hard. So I will say, once that was submitted, the written dissertation, it was off in the hands of my committee, who still had to read it and are going to grill me on it later. Yeah. But then I could focus on the slides, and that was more fun because the public seminar gave me more of a chance to be like, how do I translate my science in a way that both demonstrates competency for my committee, but is accessible and exciting for all these other folks who are coming, whether that's family members or other grad students or my completely non-science friends. So that was more of a fun challenge. It was like, how do I give this talk in a way that still shows that I did cool, innovative, high-level science, but is understandable for the people who love me and want to celebrate with me?
Yeah. And so on that note, would you mind actually explaining what are the different parts that you had to complete in order, after you received this packet, what were the different parts that you had to do?
Sure. So you have to pick 3 faculty members. 2 of them at my school have to be from Harvard, and 1 of them has to not be from Harvard. And they read your long written dissertation, and then they also attend your public talk, and they're responsible for determining if you've done enough high-quality science to be granted a PhD. So that's called your exam committee. And so after I got my packet, the first thing I had to do was pick those people with the help of my PI, Maria, who could advise on who might have appropriate expertise, because they also need to be approved by Harvard as being well fit to my project. So I had to pick my committee. Then I had to schedule the actual defense, which was maybe the hardest part, because you're trying to schedule these very accomplished scientists and also the people you love and want to be able to be there and book a room and get it all to come together. So once you got it all scheduled and you've got your committee, you have to write the dissertation, which mine ended up being about 200 pages double-spaced. And it's often fit to these really picky formatting guidelines that are not flexible at all. And so it was really annoying, like for no reason, it felt like. And then, so that long dissertation is probably something that won't be read by almost anyone ever, except for my committee and maybe some grad student in 10 years trying to find a niche topic that I focused on. The point of it is mainly to convey to the committee the body of work that I accomplished over my 5 years here. So once I turned in that written document, I turned my attention to this 1-hour public seminar, which is to explain at a level that's supposed to be accessible to scientists in general what it is I've discovered. And then after the public seminar, where I share a 1-hour summary of my work, which kind of necessarily can't encompass everything that was in the written thing, then the exam committee faculty whisks me away to a private room where they question me for what turned out to be the full 2 hours that you're supposed to allot for this. And then at the end of that, they have some deliberations and they decide if you've earned the PhD, and also kind of give you more general feedback and advice about both your project and, it turns out, the future, which I did not know, but it was really helpful.
Yeah. Wow. And this is just a curious point that I have from like just being a little nosy. So in the past, I've seen that they used to like print out binder versions of the full dissertation and like give it to you and then keep one in the department or whatever they used to do. Do you know if they still do that anymore?
That's a great question. It also brings up one more step that I forgot because I haven't done it yet. So when you're meeting with a committee, even if they say, okay, congratulations, doctor, you're a PhD, which they did, it doesn't mean you're 100% done. Because at the end of the day, they have to sign a thesis acceptance certificate. And often your committee will ask you to just revise a few things about that written document if they're not really comfortable with how strongly you've stated something. So you do have to revise the written dissertation. Then my understanding is Harvard will still print a bound copy that the department keeps. And then if you want, for your own personal reasons, you can pay to have more like real book bound copies made for you. That's my understanding, but I have not turned that thing back in yet, so I'm actually not sure. Although my committee did say, they don't need to see the revisions. They're like, you might consider changing these things, but, we're not too pressed, and we don't need to see it, and actually Maria doesn't need to see it, so we'll all sign off, but, you could consider changing these things. And I was like, yeah, I do want to change that, and I just haven't done it yet, so.
Gotcha. Yeah. All right. So basically cross the finish line and then the little caveats of putting the little bows, dotting our I's, crossing our T's.
Yeah, exactly.
So going into your exam, what was one of your biggest fears that you had to overcome in preparation for it?
Yeah. And so had to overcome. I don't know if I overcame it so much as I just accepted that it was what it was.
Yeah, that's okay too.
Like, and I shouldn't have done this, and I guess a piece of advice will also come from this, but I did experiments and got new data until like 3 days before my oral defense. So there was still data in that like week and a half between when I turned in my written dissertation that I didn't have at that point, and I shouldn't have done that. That's ridiculous. It's like, but the fear then that was connected is I haven't done enough. They're going to judge me for not tying up this one loose end. Out of the 100 conclusions I did give them, it's almost like if I was aware of any loose ends, it was my fault if I didn't tie them up. So I had to do those last experiments to tie them up, which looking back, it wouldn't have made a difference if I hadn't done them. And it probably just added to my stress a lot. And even then, I ran to a point where I was like, I have to stop. Today literally has to be the last experiment because you won't be able to go to the microscope and image this in time. Let it go. But I think I probably should have let it go a little earlier. But definitely the fear was they're going to be mad if I didn't do every experiment I could ever think of that would contribute more valuable data.
Yeah. And it's hard to determine as a scientist, whatever. It's like, oh, but like there's so much time. It's just an experiment. It's just this. It's just that.
Yeah, I honestly think I needed Maria to like look me in the eye and be like, you've done enough. Stop. Stop. If you want to stay for a couple weeks after you defend and do these, sure. But just stop for now. Focus, rest, get your talk in good shape.
Yeah, and it's definitely very hard for, as most scientists are very perfectionist-driven
what if
people.
I just do a little more? Like, what if,
Yeah.
but I could just have this little more data and, like, wouldn't that be interesting? And she would have to be like, yeah, it would be interesting. Just take care of yourself. And I'm like, oh, I am. Don't worry.
Make sure you have plenty of time to, like you said, rest and recover before.
And also just think about the interpretation of your data, because at some point it gets a little sloppy, which I will talk about a little later. My committee was not super thrilled that I presented some data that was so raw that Maria hadn't even necessarily seen it yet. And they kind of called me out because accurately, there was some data that I hadn't chewed on enough yet to really understand the full implications and interpretations of it.
Yeah.
And so they're like, it was really brave of you, / you shouldn't have included data that's that preliminary at this point. And your story was already good without it. And this just kind of looks a little sloppy.
Yeah.
And so it was actually a little counterproductive, right?
Yeah. That's so interesting. And I guess that kind of ties in real nice to our next question. So looking back now, is there any advice that you would have given yourself before finalizing your written or oral dissertation?
At some point, you just stop. Someone told me, and I think I had trouble internalizing it, that really once your committee checks your box, which means your old committee. I guess this is complicated.
Yeah.
So I said I picked faculty for my defense exam, but my whole PhD, I've also had a different committee of expert faculty with whom you meet every 6 to 9 months to judge your progress. And this group of faculty are the ones who have to kind of, together with your PI, sign off and agree that you've done enough. You may write your dissertation. And so at Harvard, we call that getting your box checked. And so I was told, and I didn't internalize it, that when you get your box checked, that effectively means you've done enough. Unless your committee explicitly tells you that point, we want to see these final experiments, it generally means the experiments you've done are enough. And now you need to move towards really wrapping it up, polishing it, not so much continuing to expand the scope of your research. And so now looking back, I'd tell myself at that last committee meeting when my box was checked, that was probably an appropriate time to write like the absolute necessary final experiments, do those, and maybe not be branching out into new things before my defense.
Yeah, such a good piece of advice. And what advice might you have for a student who is applying this year or just starting their PhD journey?
You'll get there. It's amazing how every defense I've gone to, it always comes together. And I've gone to some defenses where in the days preceding, people were like, this is a tragedy, this is a mess, it's not going to come together, I should reschedule. And then every time you go to those defenses, it sounds like the cleanest story. It sounds perfect. It will come together. Your committee and your PI won't let you get there if you weren't ready to do it.
Right.
And so just focus in the years before on putting together good science. The actual exam, you'll do it. It always comes together if you've done this good body of work over the years, and you really have to understand, of course, what you've done and what it means. But once you understand it and own it at that level, the exam will come together. It's not that big of a deal. It does determine your PhD or not.
Yeah.
But it comes together. Yeah.
Yeah. And so as you're wrapping up your time here, what is next for you? Dr. Courtney.
Yeah, so I will be moving to Stanford to start a postdoc, so a postdoctoral fellow position, because I do ultimately want to be academic faculty. So the next step is pretty usually postdoc. And so I'll be moving to be a postdoc in the lab of a man named Bill Robinson, who studies human immunology. I'm actually not going to start till January, so it's just early October now. I defended in early September, so it's kind of a long gap, but I chose to stay in my current lab with Maria for basically 2 months, September and October, to tie up those loose ends, and maybe do a couple more experiments, and also to just train some people on some techniques that like maybe I had specialty in the lab and maybe others haven't learned so much. And so her and I agreed to have me stay those extra couple months, and then I'm actually going to take a couple months off before I start my postdoc in January. So November and December, I'm hoping to just do some reflection, maybe some writing, some
rest
sleeping
and
at
recovery.
Yeah, so I'm really excited for all of that. I don't know how I'll handle the vacation, but hopefully it's fun.
Yeah, because it's really a transition period.
I haven't had downtime in like ever. I don't know.
I am truly so excited for you. So I have some last wrap-up questions here for you. First, what is something that you wish you could tell your pre-dissertation self in preparation for this exam? Or what about your younger self? Is there anything that you would like to say to G1 Ya'el?
So I'm going to kind of lean toward the first part of the question, which was what's something I wish I could tell my pre-dissertation self? But I'm going to kind of interpret it differently as what was a piece of advice I got, like maybe a couple that were that looking back now were so good. And one was from Maria, and I had asked her, hey, like as I head into that private exam where my committee can be grilling me on like, it can be really fine mechanistic hard details, it can be huge meta questions. I said, is it fine to like bring notes? Because I'm like, at some point there's these tiny details that I can't remember. I can't memorize them all just for memorizing. But if I have notes prepared, then I can anticipate all the questions they could possibly have. And she's like, no, don't do that. She said, don't do that. People don't do that. You know what you know at this point. And she's like, if it's been something that's been salient throughout your PhD or a kind of a core detail, you'll remember it. And if it's one of those little tiny gene names that you read last week when you were cramming, it's fine to just say if they ask you a question, oh, I know I read a paper about that last week. I forget what gene it was, but I can look back, and that's a good point. I should look at what genes might be involved in this pathway.
Yeah.
And so kind of don't kill yourself at the end cramming with like notes about tiny details. Trust your experience and your knowledge of the topic. And then also I think inherent to that is just be comfortable saying when you've hit the end of your knowledge. Because I think the committee is always trying to get at that a little bit. And it's okay to be like, I don't know that. And it can be accompanied with, I don't know that, and that's embarrassing because I should. I'm sorry. Or I don't know. That's a cool question. Do you have any papers or any like researchers you recommend? Because there were some things my committee asked me that I legitimately followed up on after, and they didn't think less of me for not knowing it in the moment. They were just kind of more exploring how I think as a scientist, and was that something I had spent time thinking about or would acknowledge was maybe important to think about. So that's the advice is like, once you're close, there's no point cramming. Trust what you know, but also be humble and be ready to say you don't know. They're not going to fail you because you didn't know something. Yeah.
That's such a beautiful piece of advice and a true testament to something that I like to say too is like, you know what you know now, and 6 months from now, you'll know more. And at the end of the day, you can't be upset that 6 months from now, you know something that you don't know now. Like, you have to work with what you have in this moment. And again, like, it's okay to not know something in the sciences. It's very sad that it's not accepted to be that way, though. Like, it's definitely a pressure of, like, you should know answers to all these questions. You should be able to answer these things, even if it's, like, something really intense in an adjacent field and you don't really study that. And it's
like my opinion is, look, Google exists.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Well, it's like my freshman year of college, I had this chemistry professor for honors Gen Chem who looked at the periodic table and was like, well, if you don't have this memorized, you shouldn't even be in this class.
Okay.
And I was like, first of all, why would I memorize that? I can have a chart next to me. I can look that up in a blink of an eye.
Yeah.
I don't see the point in, like, memorize things just to memorize them. If I'm good at using the resources I have, when I'm actually planning those important experiments, I don't need to have it memorized.
Yeah.
And if I work with something enough, of course I'll have it memorized. It'll just come naturally to me once I get to know it. And so I've always been very anti that, like memorization and regurgitating just for the sake of it.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. What is the best piece of advice you have received while preparing for your next step?
Okay. Yeah, so, I knew I wanted to go into academia, so I knew I needed to do a postdoc. And a couple of good pieces of advice as I was doing that is that I want a pretty quick postdoc, at least in terms of how people in biology and neuroscience typically think about them. I've known people who did kind of 4-year postdocs, 8-year postdocs, everything in between. I would really like to do a 3-year postdoc, or at least plan for that and plan to be applying to faculty positions at the end of that cycle. So as I was interviewing, I made sure to feel out the directors of those labs as to how they felt about that. And it was a good litmus test for if they're like, oh, well, that might be possible, but just be ready to give that up. I was like, okay, well, that's a red flag right off the bat.
Yeah.
Whereas the lab I joined, he was like, okay, you got to hit the ground running. There's not going to be an exploratory year, but it's doable. Let's plan a project that is conducive to that. And you have to understand you're going to have to work hard, but we can also intentionally think of projects that fit in that time scale. And so just approaching it with intentionality, knowing what your hope for timeline is, communicating that before you commit to a group. Because if you get hired and then suddenly you're like, oh, by the way, I want to do a 3-year postdoc. And they're like, oh, well, we do 7-year postdocs. And you're like, well, oops.
Yeah.
And so I've already written a couple of grants with my PI. And we've talked just so explicitly about, I want one big paper, a couple other small papers. When I need to be applying for more grants that might transition me to faculty, we've already laid out this timeline and just been very intentional. And of course, I'll be flexible if it doesn't work out exactly like that, but it feels so good to go in with a plan.
Yeah.
So that I can design things to be efficient around that plan and with a PI who supports kind of my career goals and the timeline on which I want to accomplish those.
Yeah. And that is so important. It's communicating timelines. And that's just across the board. That's not even just a postdoc prep thing. That's also as you're rotating in labs, as you're finding PhD programs. Like if people are typically graduating in 7 years and that's not what you want, well, then you might not want to look at that program. And so our last question for today is to our viewers that may be at any stage of their PhD journey, what would you like to say to them? Do you have any last words of encouragement or thoughts for them?
I think maybe I'll talk about something I haven't talked about yet much, which is how do you know when you want to schedule your defense? And so I know everyone wants to be done, right? Everyone in your PhD, the point is to get it and to be done. But it's not really, because we're all getting our PhD for some reason, right? For some imagined path or goal. So until you kind of have your next steps after that defense at least planned or like hoped for, there's no point in rushing the defense, because then all of a sudden you're going to be like a bird who just got kicked out of the nest and it's like, where do you go? And so I remember like before my box checking meeting, I had talked to Maria about, well, when do you think I should defend? When's the fastest I could defend? And this was maybe a conversation in September last year. She's like, well, the fastest would be April, but that would be a lot of grinding, a lot of hard work, and you don't know where you're going next yet, so what's the point? And from that, I kind of heard, I should be thinking about my next steps and the timeline of that. And so I think my advice is just, as you're thinking about wrapping up, just finishing isn't the only goal. You also deserve to be thinking about your next steps. It's okay to take some time as a PhD to start aligning those next steps. And then Maria, I love the way she phrased it. At one point, she's like, you should defend when it serves you best. At some point, you're ready. And then you get to pick a timeline that's going to help you meet those next goals if you get the security of lining up that next position. And I know there are some programs where funding kind of restrictions might encourage you to be faster, but I would encourage you to do what serves you and to do what helps you get to that next position, the whole reason you got into this PhD in the first place. Don't rush just to rush.
Yeah, and never try to cheap out on the resources that you have immediately near you. Because once you leave your program, all those resources are gone. Like, I mean,
they take away your email so fast.
Like
your Google Drive, your career services. And a lot of universities have these offices that are meant to help prepare you for the next step and these career fairs and things like that. And when you graduate, suddenly that is not so accessible to you. So really maybe even turning your focus in the last 2 years on exploring possibilities and maybe in the last year on making sure you're a good candidate for those possibilities.
Yeah.
Because once you're out, you're out.
Yeah.
And it's nicer to navigate the next steps in like the relative safety of your PhD institution, right?
Yeah, yes, of course.
And while you still have health insurance.
Yeah. While you still, that is a huge one. While you still have health and
a paycheck, like a small paycheck, but a paycheck.
Just being in the most ideal world.
Yeah.
Yeah, working with that. So I don't have any more questions for you for today. And I do want to give you another special thank you for, starting this podcast series with me, but coming back and doing another episode with me. Like, it has truly been an honor to get to interview you for both of these times. And to all of our listeners out there, I want to say thanks again for tuning into this episode of Navigating the Hidden Curriculum. Check out the show notes for more on Dr. Ya'el Courtney and her work, along with my other social media platforms and podcast episodes. I will catch you guys next time. This has been Monet the Creator.